Your body is hanging by a thread because your soul is wanting to see if your main journey, your main learning is over or not. What does this mean? In my personal case, I know the exact two things that I need to get before I'm done. So, this is not depression, this is not hopelessness. I know the main two things that my soul has to thoroughly experience before I'm done. At least as much as I understand. So, a lot of the high gurus like Paramahansa Yogananda, they knew when they were going to go. And for them, of course, death was not something very sad, because they believed in energy. They believed that they would transcend their body. But a lot of, when you work on yourself so deeply, you start to understand, I reviewed this entire lifetime, and I was supposed to get two things, like money and surrender to love, for example. I just took those from the sky. You have your own. If you review your life, you see that the main couple of things you've been trying to resolve, there's usually not 350 of them. It's those tough pills to swallow, as the Americans say. What is a tough pill to swallow? Some people cannot be completely vulnerable in love. It's too dangerous. Some people constantly worried about money. Some people, wrestling with fear. You'll know. Anyways, Shivananda is saying, your soul is very clear about the main things you're here to learn. And once you're done, he's saying, the soul has a very easy time dropping the body. Because it knows it's not going to be eaten by worms underground. And then he goes on to say, he says, a lot of people ask me, Swamiji, what's the difference between my own pure consciousness and cosmic, universal consciousness? And he kind of smirks here. He says, comparing your own clarity of mind in deep meditation to the mind that exists in this forest land, comparing the two, is like comparing sky with sky. Aman yesterday brought up the example of if you float a bottle of soda water on the Pacific Ocean, at first you're thinking that the water in the bottle is separate from the ocean until you poke a hole in it. Same thing with, your clear-mindedness in meditation as compared to the intelligence of nature. And Shivananda is saying it's the same thing. It's just water in a bottle floating on an ocean. Once you poke a hole in that boundary, there is no difference. And I can tell you this, any student of mine over 40 years who's had a strikingly clear moment in meditation will tell you that the feeling was, I am that. Now, listen to the feeling of the ego. The ego says, me versus 9 billion people. Where am I going to get my breakfast money? So I'm exaggerating. This is the ego. Me versus 9 billion people. How am I going to get my promotion? How will I protect myself if I'm living all by myself in a one-bedroom in New York City? See, it's me versus the thug. Okay? Now, any student who's had a glimpse of momentary transcendence will say, the me then turns into I am that. You're suddenly identified with an energy that is all over. So think back to moments where your mind suddenly goes empty and you more or less feel like the me, protection of me, my breakfast, my safety, red skin, black skin, yellow skin, suddenly turns into what is in me is what is everywhere. And then he describes the state of Jivan Mukta as an experiencer that goes from one experience to another experience to another. So imagine this morning you're walking into the kitchen to have your breakfast, and the feeling changes from Patricia picking up a croissant, Patricia putting butter and raspberry jam on a croissant. For the Jivan Mukta, it's this pair of eyes, and it sees raspberry jam, it sees the frying pan, it sees sunny side up eggs, and then through the tongue, it experiences bacon and eggs. So again, I'm trying to describe this in words. Imagine you've turned into a pair of eyes, and all day you're just experiencing scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. So Aman, what's the best way you can describe? What's the difference between becoming a pair of eyes and fully experiencing moment by moment versus Amandeep, his past history, his memories, his Indian culture, dad's blood running through my veins? What's the difference between these two states of being? So, there could be a missile attack, but you're just experiencing it. There's no subconscious that the missile attack sinks into, so that 5 days later when you hear a firecracker, you break into cold sweat. That's conditioning. A pheasant in a bush, if it sees a hound dog, at that moment it's experiencing fear, flies off, but there's no subconscious mind. Of course, you can train animals, so there you can condition them. If you want your dog to shake hands with you, there are ways of doing that. Okay, good. So that's the answer I was kind of fishing for. Is that a pair of eyes just going from this experience to that experience to that experience? I told you one day I woke up, my feet were dangling from the mattress, and just for that time, I experienced stepping into one frame of time, and then I went to the next frame of time, and then the third frame of time. I mean, if we're lucky, we have at least one of those experiences where the mind is so quiet. You're going from frame to frame. People who fall in love, they say, time stops. A painter is totally engrossed, says, time stops. So you just become an experiencer. Athletes have this expression, the flow. There have been tennis players who have won Wimbledon. They weren't aware that the match was over. Maybe happened, 108 years, maybe it's happened once or twice. That's how deep the flow was. And then he talks about how sensual, gregarious, funny, and easygoing the God force is. So, nobody can say, I'm an authority on God. But Vivekananda is saying, as far as I've experienced it, this force is not angry, it's not revengeful, it's not opposed to sensuality or sex. It's just, there's a big sense of humor. So then we see all this suffering in the world. Say, that God is really a sickle. And then we have to ask ourselves, where's the suffering coming from? I mean, World War I is happening because of God. You always come back to the mind. The mind gets conditioned. And then it wreaks all sorts of havoc. Vivekananda says, once you get to know your own soul, then you know all souls. This is that old saying that everything comes from inside out. You dive deep into a particular meditation, or you're doing your yoga asanas, and your attention goes somewhere very deep, and for the first time, you really get to know your own essence. Whatever your essence is. You get to know that essence, and then you go to Grand Central Station in New York, and all of a sudden you feel like you know the shoeshine boy, you know the prostitute, and you know the investment banker. How come? Vivekananda says, once you get to know your own soul, strangely, you know every other soul. Think about this saying, everything comes from inside out. If you're stingy with yourself, suddenly you're surrounded by stingy friends. If you're lying to yourself, suddenly your executive secretary is lying to you. It goes by resonance, frequency. You're attracting exactly what you're believing. And then he says something very challenging. He says, someone like a serial killer is still a saint whose ego has not allowed him to get a direct experience of his soul. So here we're talking about ego versus soul. The ego is conditioned. It has fear, it has aggression, it has bad memories from the past. Maybe he was beaten by his stepdad. All of that is a conditioned mind. But at the level of Shivananda, he's saying, you give me a serial killer, I just see a soul that is being overshadowed by a stubborn ego. And this is not too far-fetched. If you study what's been written about prisoners in prison, there have been some cases where a prisoner, somebody who's killed 3 people, goes to the prison library, finds the Bible, gets engrossed in it, picks up some teachings from Christ, the Buddha, and then suddenly that prisoner turns into the prison saint. But the same person has killed 3 people. So what he's saying is, we all have egos, we all have souls. In some of our cases, in this lifetime, we see the lie of the ego and we disbelieve in the lie of the ego. And then the moment you open the window, the light shines in. Meaning, the moment you disbelieve ego, that very moment, the light of soul shines in. He says something that will be useful for, we have several executives and professionals in the room. He says, your worldly activity, your problem-solving skills, and your creativity are happening by themselves as the witness watches on. This is something very scary for a professional to try. You walk into your law firm and you're testing the theory that if you continue staying with your breathing, if you move your pencil and keep your attention on breath comes in, breath goes out, if you are oming in the hallway despite all the stress in the law firm, that your body will carry out worldly activity as your transcendent self, as your meditative self watches on. I've had a couple of students who either stuttered or they were very, very nervous public speakers behind the podium. And I asked them, I brought 6 other people in. I asked them to make public speeches without looking at their notes, but I gave them the technique of following the breath only. And they said, well, that's impossible, Kambiz. I need to remember the contents of my speech. I said, no, you watch my finger. As I move my finger, I just want you to breathe in and out, and I want you to go through your speech. What happened is, as they started to look at the finger, and it was an exercise, as they got engrossed in the motion of the breath, something about the stutter and something about the fear of public speaking was forgotten.